Okay. So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's uh, lecture with me, and special thank you to John and Alex for hosting this wonderful conference. And I'm very grateful to have the chance to participate. So, today's lecture that I'm going to share with you is on the race to the base, realizing scores in real time. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of teaching a keyboard skills class. And I'd like to suggest that these two skills of score reading and harmonization are very, very closely related. And the skill of harmonization can be used actually for aiding score reading. And we're going to use some schemata and a little bit of analysis to help us do that. So I want to just give an overview of some of the content that's covered in these keyboard skills courses. So here's one from McGill University. This is a graduate level course. So if you look at the course description, it says musicianship training in keyboard skills required for research, score study, professional presentations, and teaching, figure-based realization, melody harmonization, transposition, score reading, improvisation, and performance for dictation. Okay, so that's a lot of skills to be covered in. This is one semester, right? Here's one from Eastman. This is also a graduate level course, intermediate keyboard skills. This covers score reading, figured bass, realization, transposition, melody harmonization, and pop symbols. And then we have keyboard skills one. This is at my university, Beijing Normal Baptist University. This one is geared toward undergrad students, but similarly, we cover clef reading, figured bass, harmonization, transposition. This one also covers singing, conducting while playing. Okay, so as you can see, there are so many different topics, different skills that are expected to be covered in these keyboard skills courses. And this can be quite daunting and overwhelming for students. However, I would suggest that we can address this issue with score reading. But just to summarize what's going on, I think the main purpose of these courses is to develop a holistic set of musicianship skills. As Steve Flates would call it, the complete musician. The key topics covered, I would divide into two categories. So score reading, which involves transposition, reduction, coordination, as well as improvisation. We have transposition, arranging, harmonization, figured bass, lead sheet, realization. Okay, so I sort of see these as two sides of the same coin, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Um, so as I already mentioned, one of the key challenges is just the broad, um, um, just how broad the topics are that is expected to be covered in these courses. And as well, there's usually a wide gap in levels between students within a class. There are students all over the spectrum of proficiency within a single class. So how do we deal with um, this this gap as well as this breadth of topics? And I would like to suggest that score reading and improvisation have a lot to do with this. So let's take a look at score reading. On one hand, we have score reading where there's too much information that's presented. Now, in some cases, we do need to play all the notes, but there are other cases, such as when playing a reduction, when it's okay to simplify and drop some notes. And there's a way to do that in a way that still preserves the spirit of the music. And as we'll see, bass harmonization will um, help us to do that. So one of the problems that students might encounter is that they might feel overwhelmed by what they see on the page. So the process for dealing with this is reductive in nature. So we're taking too much information, boiling it down to something that's more manageable for the student's particular skill sets. So this is very adaptable to any particular student's level through reduction. On the other hand, we have improvisation, where there's not enough information on the page and the student has to intuit or somehow create new material based on the little pieces of information that are given. So the students may feel that they need some guidance on how to do that. Um, but here the process is creative. And so I see these as going hand in hand. And we can connect these two through pattern recognition. So that involves schema theory, as well as transformation of these patterns, such as transposition. And this is done in real time. So, for example, improvisation has to be done in real time. That's just by definition. That's the nature of improvisation. And likewise with score reading, that's also something that needs to be done in real time. If it's not done in real time, we would just call that analysis. And likewise with improvisation, if it's not done in real time, we would call that composition. Um, so here are the three R's that I'd like to tell my students for simplifying scores. The first one is probably the easiest to do. So this is reduction, or to reduce. And this involves dropping ornaments, doublings, including octaves, thirds, and sixths. Sometimes it's just not worth it to play them. If there are arpeggiated figurations, they can be simplified into block chords. And this happens to be, I think, the least invasive procedure, the least invasive R out of the three. The other two require a little more discernment. The second one here is redistribution. So here we're changing the register and the voicing, who plays what? Does the left hand or right hand play the tenor part? So that's redistribution. And then the third one is to rewrite using familiar patterns. So sometimes you just find some ridiculous pattern on the page, and it's just much easier to use a pattern that you already are familiar with, scales, arpeggios, and patterns that you see all the time. So as I mentioned, the last two here require a little more discernment, and we're going to rely more on our base harmonization to help us to do that. So these are the factors, these are the parameters that we should avoid changing. So the first one is meter. So the meter, I was careful to say rhythm, or not to say rhythm, because I think it can be simplified under certain circumstances. But the meter definitely should be preserved. Otherwise, that will really change the structure and the nature of the music. And as well, the melody, if there is one, or maybe there are several, we need to be careful not to alter these too much. These, as well as the harmony, these really form the backbone of a piece of music. So now, with that being said, let's use base harmonization as a guide for implementing the three R's. So reduce, redistribute, and rewrite. Okay, so let's take 6/5 chords. For instance, I'm going to use this to show some examples of base harmonization. So something I typically do with my students is for each chord type, so in this case, 6/5 chords, I start with a voicing. So here we have small, let me pull up my keyboard. Okay, so we have small, medium, and large. And I think that's pretty easy to remember for students just because of the size of the voicing in the right hand. So that's keyboard style. Chorale style is very similar. We just bring the alto voice down to the tenor. So we have 2 plus 2. And we can even bring the bass up to make a third if we want. Okay, but these are the basic voicings that you'll encounter for 6/5 chords. And as we'll see, we'll really only encounter them on scale degrees 4 and 7. And this can be seen in the rule of the octave as well. If you look at the rising 4 and 7, you'll see that they're harmonized with a 6/5 chord, and they resolve upward by a step to a more stable 5/3 chord. So that's the context in which we will find these 6/5 chords. So then the next step is to introduce some patterns that use 6/5 chords. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just a couple of the more common ones, I would say. So here we have the Galant cadence. And by the way, I'm very new to this community, so I might not be using all these terminology correctly. So please forgive me if there's anything incorrect about my analyses. And please feel free to correct me. So anyway, we have what I call here the Galant cadence, and we can do this in minor as well. And I ask the students to play through these and um, do it in a couple of different keys. So that right away um, works on the scale of transposition. So we have the converging cadence, we have the comma, the long comma, which has scale degree 6 as well. The 6/5, the 5 in the 6/5 is optional. We can just play it like that. We have the do, re, mi. I forgot to write 6/5 here, but there should be a 6/5 here. That's just one variant. Usually we just see a 6/3 chord on the 7. And so the students would have already encountered this in a previous class. And the monte is basically a comma in 4 and a comma in 5, comma in 2, comma in 1 gives us the fonte. Okay, so we're going to use these schemata in our analyses of these different scores. So here's an example by Schumann, and I've only given you the melody and the bass, and I've simplified the texture a little bit, just to show you what's really going on. And as you can see, there are many, many 6/5 chords, and the students can notice right away that all these 6/5 chords are moving upward. So, if they see 6/5 on the bass note, they can sort of predict what's going to come next. So here, normally we expect to go to root position chord, but we continue moving upward until here. The 9 here is really a suspension. So the first step is to look for 6/5 schemata in the bass. And I don't really need to look at the melody. It's there. It can be helpful, but the main thing we're looking at is the bass. So here we have a long comma in B flat. We have 6, 7, 1. If we look here, we have another long comma, so basically transposed, but this time in G minor. And then we have a monte going up, right? So we have scale degree 3, 4, sharp 4, 5 in the bass. So, so hopefully we can train students to, look for these very specific patterns. And, I'm not introducing all of these patterns at once. I'm being very targeted in the patterns that I choose. So this particular week, we would cover 6/5 chords, and they all have the same kind of voicing and voice leading. So now step 2 is to sing and harmonize the chords. And as a preliminary step, we could also just play the chords. So we could have okay, so there's a bit of repetition in the right hand voicing, and that's to be expected in this example, and that actually reinforces the voicing and the voice leading. So I think this is a good example for that. So now, of course, we can add the singing as well. We have mi, 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 fa, do, re, re, do, re, la, si, si, mi, do, fa, re, so, fa, la. Okay, so once we can do that, we can add an active accompaniment, and by active, by that I mean some kind of diminution. So we could have some kind of chords, something like that, or we could have something more broken, and so on. Um, and so this is a very creative element in this entire process. And we haven't even looked at the original score. So there's a lot we can deduce just by looking at the bass. And then the next step we can take is to transpose. And how do we transpose this down by a half step? At first this sounds like a very difficult task. Um, so we're also supposed to train clef reading. And so we can use that as a way to um, transpose this. So maybe I'll skip to the slide. So we can use the clef substitution wheel to tell us how to substitute the clefs. Okay, so if we start with bass clef and we want to transpose down by a second, we can use alto clef. Or if we want to um, start with treble clef, so maybe we start with treble clef and we want to transpose down by step, we can use tenor clef. And so this order of clefs is preserved. And here's how it's derived, by the way. So we have treble clef, and then you skip one. You have soprano, skip one, mezzo soprano, skip one, alto, skip one, tenor, skip one, baritone, skip one, bass, skip one, and we're back to treble. And we can see that the clefs, if you arrange them all in order by range, they are skipping in thirds. So that's how we derive this wheel. Okay, so back to what we were trying to do. We were trying to transpose down. We use alto and tenor clefs to do that. Okay, so if I read this bass clef in in alto clef, let me bring that back up. Okay. Well, the figures don't actually change, and I read the bass clef in alto clef. I do have to adjust the accidentals a little bit, but I think it should be pretty clear by the function as to what we should do. So we have a raise 6, raise 7, and then everything else here is diatonic. And then we have a diminished 7th going to the dominant. Okay, and then the melody, of course, we can use tenor clef to read that. So when we actually look at the real OG original score, and we shouldn't be too daunted by what we see because we've already prepared for the chords as well as the accompanimental pattern, and we've also prepared the transposition as well. So let's go, yeah, so here, yeah. Okay, so the actual score looks something like this. We have triplets as the accompaniment pattern, and we have some octaves in the bass, or sometimes it's not an octave, but we have another note. But that's not a big deal because just looking at the bass, we can sort of expect there to be some rising motion. So this helps us to read ahead. So we have oops. And so this one example trains so many different skills. So if we take a step back and see what we did, so we identified some schemata, we did some analysis, and then we did sing and play. So that's coordination. We harmonized the bass line using an accompanimental pattern, so that we could say is improvisation. And then finally, looking at this, we were able to make some kind of reduction in our heads as we played this. Not to mention transposition, right? So many different skills trained using one example, and this can be adapted to many different levels. Let's take a look at another example. This time, um, yeah, okay, there's a clef substitution. Example this time by Haydn. So again, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to see what kind of patterns or schemata we can find that involve 6/5 chords. And most of these are going to be drawn from that previous slide with all these schemata. Okay, so the first one here, we have the do, re, mi, and then the do, re, mi goes to the bottom. And then here we have a comma repeated, and then we have a Cudworth cadence. And some of these patterns have a 6 chord, which may or may not have a 5 attached to them. But just to be safe, we're going to prepare both cases. Okay, so the first step I would say is to realize the figured bass. Okay, so I'm going to just start here. We could really start in any one of these positions. So we have okay, so that's a very simple keyboard style harmonization of this bass line. And already that's going to help us a lot with the upper voices. The second step here, because we have so many voices, we're going to look at the violin 1 part. That's going to give us sort of a bound, an upper bound for the register. And, oops. And so the inner voices, the violin 2 and viola will usually fit within inside that range. Okay, so I'm going to realize that one more time, but I'm going to put the main notes of the violin 1 on the top. Then all of a sudden here we jump. So I'm taking the range of the violin 1 into account when I'm doing the realization. And now the next step is to put the other notes back in, but as we'll see, they're more parenthetical, especially the first 2 bars up here. If we left them out, that wouldn't be so serious because they don't actually contribute to the structure. Yeah, they don't contribute to the structure that much. So if I go and play every note, so we notice that these are in parallel thirds. It might just be enough to play, that might just be enough. Okay, now here, it gets a bit tricky because if you look at the actual voicing, so we have a 10th between the viola and cello, and we have an octave between the 2 violins, right? So we have these 10ths. That's kind of difficult to play, and some students are not able to reach a 10th. That's just not practical, and that's fine. So how do we deal with that? Well, here's where the second R comes in. That's redistribution. And I'm going to move the viola part up. But more easily, I'm just going to read the 6/5 chord and keep in mind what I have for this rhythm. Okay, so I'm just moving at the same rate as the bass. Okay, so okay, and the same thing. I have a 13th here. That's just way too large. I'm going to play it up here, an octave higher. Now here I have these parallel sixths. So I'm just going to drop one of them because it turns out this is actually really difficult to play. and it might just not be worth it. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, so we have something like that. And, it's very similar to what I would have done just by realizing these chords. I added a little bit of diminution based on the violin one part, but the inner voices, I didn't really look so carefully at every note. And this is a problem that I see often with students is that they look down at their hands, and especially when there's a wide range between two voices. And so after looking at the hands, what happens is that, well, they're not looking at the score. So then they lose their place, and then they have to take some time to find their place again in the score. So that uses up valuable time and energy. And so by redistributing, we can actually save time and energy. So that's one trick we can use in this case. And I'm going to show perhaps one more example. I think that's what we might have time for. So this one is a lead sheet. So there are some quirks to keep in mind for 6/5 chords. Of course, we have seventh chords in first inversion. So the first example here is probably the most common way. So we have G7/B. So B is the third. So you'll see something like that. As well, we have diminished seventh chords that are inverted on the page, but written as a 6/5. But because they're symmetrical, we can just write them with the lowest note as the root. Because it sounds the same. And when we're dealing with lead sheets, we're trying to keep it simple and clean looking on the page. The third chord here we could write as D minor 7/F, but it's, again, simpler to just write F6. So F major and then add a sixth on top. And likewise with C minor sixth and E minor sixth, E minor flat sixth. And the flat sixth meaning minor sixth in this case. Okay, so we have here's A Whole New World from Disney. Students love it. So again, we have very similar steps for this particular example. We're going to look for patterns that we've seen before. Just for time's sake, I'm going to go through these quite quickly. So these are all 6/5 chords. And so how are they used? Well, these all happen to be commas. This one happens to be a long comma, scale degree 6 and 7 going up. And we can also use this to sort of predict the next chord. Okay, so this one is unresolved, so that's sort of an exception. But here, we have an A sharp in the bass. So without even looking at the next chord, we can sort of guess, okay, that's going to have a B minor, or there's going to be some kind of B in the next bass note. And that's because we have a leading tone, dominant seventh with a leading tone in the bass, right? So that 6/5 position is going to push upward, and the same for all these other examples. And again, we're going to sing the melody while harmonizing the bass line. And we can add an accompaniment, something very simple, maybe quarter notes in the right hand and a dotted rhythm in the left hand. Something like this. Da, 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 da. Yeah, I'm not going to embarrass myself with my singing, but that's the idea. We could take this a step further and transpose. And say we want to transpose up by a half step. Well, if we go back to the wheel, you'll see that alto clef is the one to use. And then all these lead sheets just go up by a half step. Okay, but the function, the quality of the chords, that doesn't change. So and that's actually doable. It might take a little bit of time, but it's actually doable. So what I really want to drive home is that score reading and improvisation or harmonization, these are really skills that can be integrated to help one another. Today, I happen to talk about it more from the score reading angle, but the goal here is to develop holistic musicianship. Reduction and creation. So these are opposite processes. And the end result kind of sounds the same. It's kind of similar, but the perspective is quite different. And so the way we approach it um, can help us to reinforce the learning of these skills. And it can be adapted for a wide range of levels. And finally, the last point I'd like to make is that skills should be trained first separately because there's so many things going on. But eventually they should be integrated and the assessments should be integrated just from a practical standpoint. If you have a dozen or even 2 dozen students and you need to listen to them play and there's only five, no more than 10 minutes per student, you'll need to find a way to integrate them and so test many different skills at once. And this is a great way to do it. So there you have it. Thank you very much. And I'd love to hear any feedback that you may have or any questions. You can reach me at this email address if you'd like, and can find my bio by scanning the QR code. So again, thank you very much for tuning in today. And yeah, I'd be happy to take some questions.